I first got started, and I think it's important for you to know how I got started in this area of covering counterterrorism. I operate an organization. It's not a think tank, it's a do tank. We investigate, infiltrate, and expose the threat of radical Islamic groups in the United States and their ties overseas. We have an incredibly dedicated staff that does very dangerous things. We are the only nonprofit, non-governmental organization that actually infiltrates radical terrorist organizations. And without getting into too much, I can tell you we have developed an incredible amount of data that is much more frightening than what you'll ever read in any of the mainstream media. Besides, the mainstream media is part of the problem. What we face today is not only a violent jihad, and if you saw today's television stories, the man who was responsible for trying to detonate a car bomb at Times Square gave a statement to the court. And the statement to the court was very interesting. He said, I am doing this, I am a jihad warrior because I hate democracy, I hate your system of life. So anyone in the administration today, like John Brennan, National Security Advisor, or others in the Department of Justice who say that Islamic jihadists can be appeased by simply solving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or by forcing Israel to withdraw from the territories or by stopping a man from burning the Quran is lying. The values of Islamic jihadists are totally different than Judeo-Christian values. Their values are against the whole notion of pluralism, of dissidence, of freedom of speech, of democracy, of the separation of church and state. And you must understand that this is a war that doesn't have an ending that we can see in the near future. The stealth jihad is just as dangerous as the violent jihad. Now, I know we all know what violent jihad is. It's when 9/11 happens. But the stealth jihad is something else. 5 years ago, the FBI discovered a document, a treasure trove of documents, the most important documents since the Pumpkin Papers in the 1940s. This document was part of the Muslim Brotherhood legacy and archives that was kept by a radical jihadist in Maryland, not in Maryland, but in Virginia. And what they found was hundreds of thousands of pages of documents detailing the Muslim Brotherhood's plan to take over the United States, infiltrate the media, law enforcement, the government, and the intelligentsia. And the document that was most important was called a civilizational jihadist proposal. And it said, quote, "We propose to infiltrate and destroy the system from within. This is a civilizational jihad. There is no other system other than Islam that has to reign supreme. We will take over this country, whether it's this year, next year, or 100 years. But this system will be destroyed, and Allah's victory will be made all over mankind." That's a quote from the document found in the home of Ismail al-Barasi. And that's the guiding strategy for how the stealth jihadists, primarily using our system, our democracy, our freedoms, our naivete in infiltrating the media, infiltrating the government, infiltrating intelligentsia, and infiltrating even Congress. The reality is, just the other day, 3 days ago, Chicago FBI sent a man named Kifa Mustafa to Washington, D.C. to go through the National Counterterrorism Center, which is only reserved for people who have security clearances, and to go to FBI's Quantico training program for the Citizens Advisory Group. Kifa Mustafa had a rather interesting background. He was a member of Hamas and longtime fundraiser for Hamas terrorist organizations in Chicago and in Texas. He also had been an unindicted co-conspirator in the Hamas funding trial 3 years ago. He had been a singer in a Hamas band calling for the killing of Jews and infidels. And yet somehow the Chicago FBI missed all of this and sent him right through the National Counterterrorism Training Center. This is the type of problem we face today. In February of this year, Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano had a conference on countering Islamic extremism. Actually, she didn't use the word Islamic. In fact, the word Islamic is sort of allergic to this administration. They use the term violent extremism as if we know that that means Islamic extremism. They refuse to use the term because they've succumbed to the political correctness that somehow if you use the term Islamic extremism, you're denigrating all Muslims. Not so. What we are is defining the behavior and the impetus and the motivation for radical Muslims to carry out their attacks. I remember when I was on Hannity and Combs a couple of years ago, and when I mentioned the term Islamofascism, Combs said, that's racist. So I said, how about Islamic militant? He said, racist. I said, how about Islamic extremist? He said, racist. I said, how about white racist? And then he shut up. And then I asked him, what should we do with the term Islamic Jihad? It's a group. Should we recall it the Union of the Good? The reality is, if we can't identify our enemy, we can't defeat him. And the major threat we face today, it's in Atlanta, it's in Miami. Let me just give you a brief 2-minute history of where radical Islamic cells and organizations have been present in the United States. In Tampa, Florida, the center of the Islamic Jihad organization that specializes in beheadings, in knives, in suicide bombings, was located at the University of South Florida in Tampa. In Chicago, the head of Hamas, the Bridgeview Mosque, was located and is still located and operates as an extension of Hamas, even though there have been convictions of various Hamas members. In Atlanta, there are several mosques that have spawned several major terrorist plots, including a plot involving 2 university students who were taping iconic symbols in Washington, D.C. in an attempt to blow up the Washington Monument and the Smithsonian Institution. In addition, an imam named Jamal Al-Amin was sentenced to life imprisonment for killing 2 police officers here in Atlanta. And believe it or not, almost every single Islamic group in the United States came to his defense, claiming he was framed, claiming somehow he was framed by the police and the FBI, and that has been the MO of all of these radical Islamic groups. They all stem from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, a believer in a system that sees Islam as imposing its will all over the world, including the United States. And they use deception. And that's the most dangerous aspect of the threat we face today. We all know what violence is. Yes, we will be hit again. There's no doubt about it. Because we see jihadists emerge all over. They emerged like in Fort Dix, where 13 members of American Muslim citizens who were living here for 20 years, suddenly decided to become jihadists and blow up Fort Dix to try to kill 500 U.S. soldiers. We saw Fort Hood, where a psychiatrist from Walter Reed, a Muslim psychiatrist from Walter Reed, who had espoused the dogma of holy war, was not reported by his superiors because they were afraid of being called bigots. And as a result, he was allowed to be transferred to Fort Hood, where, as you know, he took out a submachine gun yelling Allahu Akbar and killed 13 soldiers, including a woman who was pregnant. And believe it or not, last December, the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, Tom Perez, who some of you may recognize for his involvement in covering up the Philadelphia Black Panther affair, gave a speech about Mr. Hassan and said, quote, "There is no religious motivation behind his attack. We all know there are lies spread by the Islamophobics like Stephen Emerson." The reality is totally different. This effort to cover up the Islamic militant problem in the United States will be our death knell. It is the number one reason why we continue to suffer attacks, because we allow these groups to get away with murder. The Council on American Islamic Relations is a Hamas front, and yet it's been welcomed and promoted by CBS, by MSNBC, by CNN, by the New York Times, the Washington Post. The Islamic Society of North America, another Muslim Brotherhood group, had its annual conference last summer. Who was the guest speaker? Valerie Jarrett, top advisor to President Obama. At the same conference, anti-Semitic and anti-Christian lectures were given frequently. And yet they had the nerve to come to the meeting of ISNA and give a celebratory speech affirming the administration's support for this organization.